Hi, it's Penny here, and today I want to talk about some of my most read and favorite fantasy authors, and I'm going to share with you the first book I read by them as well as the last book and my most favorite book that I've read. So I've got 10 authors to talk about. Each of these I have read 4 or more things by. I've ordered this by the number of things I've read. When I say things, I mean I've grouped any series together. So some authors I've actually read like 10 or more books by them, but they don't count because they're all from the same series. So the first author on my list is a New Zealand author, and that is JC Hart, or I think at least one of her books was published under Cassie Hart, and I do still need to check out, she has also written some books under the name Nova Blake that I thought looked a little bit interesting. But anyway, I've read 4 things by Cassie. The first one I read was from her Kotahi Bay series, which is kind of like a romantic series, or more of a paranormal romance type story. It's set in New Zealand, and each book follows different women who have been given powers by different Maori gods, and kind of throughout the books the different stories interweave with each other. I did enjoy these, but as I've said many times, romantasy or romance isn't really my thing, so they weren't my favorite, even though I liked the New Zealand setting a lot. Then the latest thing I read by Cassie is Butcherbird, which is kind of more of a horror, although it has, again, I guess like a paranormal or fantastical element to it. It's basically, again, set in New Zealand, which is something I really like about reading New Zealand authors, is getting that New Zealand feel. But this is one where this woman goes home to her family home and discovers that some strange magical things are going on there. But my favorite thing by Cassie was actually Sun-Touched, and I'm a little bit sad about this one because this is the first book in a series, maybe, except Cassie's never continued it, unfortunately. It's kind of a science fiction story. I'm trying to remember, it's actually been a long time since I've read it. And I do own a copy, but it's in my boxes prepared to be moving already. But it's in this world where people believe that if they go out in the sun, then they will go mad. And I can't really remember what her motivation is, but she ends up going out in the sun and finding out what actually happens. I really liked it, and I would love it if Cassie would continue it one day, but I don't know if she ever will, unfortunately, because I think she's been having more success with other things she's been writing. Okay, then we have Robin Hobb. Now, I have a lot of Robin Hobb books on my shelves, and I have read a lot of Robin Hobb books, but I counted the whole of The Realm of the Elderlings as one thing, so I've actually only read 4 things. The Realm of the Elderlings and 3 others. So The Realm of the Elderlings was where I started with Robin Hobb, starting with Assassin's Apprentice, following Fitz, who is the bastard son of the king in waiting and eventually ends up being trained to be an assassin, and the series goes in many directions from there, but it's really just this very emotional story about this young boy trying to find his place. And then, The Realm of the Elderlings is a 15-book series. A lot happens, but I do really love this series. Then as well, the last thing that I've been reading by Robin Hobb is a new series. Well, when I say new series, I don't mean newly published, but it is the Soldier Son trilogy, which is a separate series from The Realm of the Elderlings. Although our main character, Navarre, in a lot of ways is very similar to Fitz in that he's a young man trying to find his place in this world where he is the second son, and the belief of his people is that second sons should always be soldiers. So he has this vision of a perfect life where he becomes a very respected soldier, a great leader with a loving family. But because this is a Robin Hobb book, he doesn't get any of those things. His life is kind of torn apart and everything is just getting worse and worse. I'm only about halfway through this particular book as I'm filming this, but it is breaking my heart and I am loving it. I don't know if I'd say I'm loving it as much as The Realm of the Elderlings. And there have been some other things by Robin Hobb that I have really loved, including some things she wrote as Megan Lindholm, which have this book, Inheritance, which has a bunch of Megan Lindholm short stories in it. And the first one, I really loved it. Like, if I love anything by Robin Hobb better than The Realm of the Elderlings, I think it's the first short story in this anthology, which is called A Touch of Lavender. And it's about these aliens that come to Earth and end up kind of living in the slums, and they have like this weird religious belief about music. So it's more of a sci-fi, but It's one of these stories that just has really stuck with me. I also really loved Wizard of the Pigeons by Megan Lindholm, or written under the name Megan Lindholm. But even though I love those, I do still think I have to pick The Realm of the Elderlings as my favorite by Robin Hobb, because it's 15 books and I loved all of them. And like the last book, I sobbed for an hour, so I love that series. I will say though, I said Realm of the Elderlings is where I started. I actually bought this book before I ever read The Realm of the Elderlings, not realizing that half the short stories in this are based or set in the world of The Realm of the Elderlings. I picked this up purely because it had cats on the cover, and it was only like years later, many years later, that I finally picked up The Realm of the Elderlings and realized that I was missing out by not actually reading this book that I had owned for so long. Next we have Tanya Huff, who I have read 5 things by. So the first one that I read was The Quarters Quartet. I think the first book is called Sing the Four Quarters. It's a really cool fantasy world where the magic is all based around singing, and it's elemental magic, but also there's a singing element to it, and I really loved the story. Admittedly, this is probably a bit of a fantasy romance, but I read it when I was younger, and when I was younger, I did like those things a bit more, and there is still like a bigger political story going on as well. And the covers are beautiful, even though I don't think I have good images from the web because they're so old. The covers on the web aren't as good as the covers are in real life. And I think my sister has that series. I bought it and then I think I gave it to her, which, do I regret that? Maybe. The last thing I read by Tanya Huff is Wizard of the Grove. So this is a bind-up of 2 books, I think, Child of the Grove and The Last Wizard. Now, it is possible that I read Child of the Grove in my late teens, early 20s. Is it possible? Maybe I should check the publication date. Yes, it is possible because the first book came out in 1988, but I'm still not sure. And I will admit that when I picked this up more recently, I wasn't in love with the writing style, but I do really love the concepts. We've kind of got this young girl who's been born specifically to kind of combat this evil wizard guy. Actually, that's probably not a very good synopsis. I've kind of forgotten the story, but I remember some of the concepts. So there is one character that's kind of made up of multiple goddesses, and there's another character who's kind of having a romance with death. So I love the concepts of this, but the actual writing wasn't for me, unfortunately. I would say my favorite thing by Tanya Huff is either The Quarters Quartet, or it might actually be The Keeper Chronicles. The Keeper Chronicles is another one with some really cool concepts. So we're following this young woman who takes a job at this inn because she is a keeper, and she's kind of driven to go places where there are these portals to hell so that she can basically keep people safe from it. And hell is presented as this person. I mean, they're a portal to hell. They're not a physical person, but they are kind of like a bumbling idiot, and I loved it. There's also a talking cat who is one of my favorite talking cats ever. So in some ways it's a very humorous book, but it's humor that works for me, and I just really enjoyed those books. Okay, then we have Christopher Pike, and to be honest, this is probably not the right place in the list for him. I have on Goodreads 5 things written down that I've read by him. I know that when I was in my teens, I read a lot more things by him, so he probably deserves to be higher in the list, but also the things by him that I've reread as an adult have made me question teenage me's taste. I think, again, this is one where I just really love his concepts, and I guess at the time, the writing style appealed to me. I don't know. But on Goodreads, the first thing that I read by Christopher Pike is Remember Me. This would have been a reread, and I'm not sure if it's where I started, but I would have started around there. Remember Me is about a girl who dies, and then we're following her ghost as she tries to work out how she died and protect her brother. And it actually turns into a series that I know some people really didn't like the direction of, but at the time when I read it, when I was younger, I thought it was really interesting. Then the last thing that I read by Christopher Pike was Scavenger Hunt. I don't remember what it was about. Some kind of like lizard people. Anyway, I know that I loved it when I was younger, but as an adult rereading it, not really. My favorite thing by Christopher Pike is The Last Vampire series, which was then republished as the first series, and he wrote some new books in that series. Didn't like the new books in that series, but the original 6-book series, I really loved it. So in The Last Vampire, we follow this woman who is the last vampire in the first book. It's wrapped in a lot with the mythology of Krishna. The idea is that her and her vampire boyfriend were the last vampires, and then Krishna came along and made a deal with them that they could continue to live as long as this vampire boyfriend, who was like the first of the vampires, as long as he killed off all the other vampires. But she had a deal of her own with Krishna and kind of went off, and then eventually her vampire boyfriend is now coming back to try and kill her. But the story also gets like deep into Indian mythology, and I don't know how great the representation of that is, but again, as a young person, it was really eye-opening for me and I really loved it. Then we have another New Zealand author, and that is Andy Buchanan, who also sometimes publishes as AC Buchanan. So the first thing I read by them was Invisible City, which is a short story that I know I loved at the time, but it's been so long since I read it that I don't remember the details. Something about an invisible city. I thought the concepts were amazing, but I don't remember the details anymore. Probably I need a reread. Actually, the last thing I read by Andy was also a reread, and that is This Other World. This follows an older autistic woman. Andy is autistic themselves, so it's kind of own voices representation. And this woman has moved to an alien planet and feels very much at home there. But then there's a bigger conflict happening between the city where she's living and the neighboring city that kind of escalates into war, but there's this weird psychic mystery also going on. It's very strange, but I love, again, the concepts that it gets into. And while I've loved a lot of things by Andy, I do think This Other World still stays as my favorite. Then we have Sarah Gailey, who I've also read 6 things by. The first thing I read by them was Magic for Liars, which is about this woman who's basically the sister of a Harry Potter type character. Her sister is an amazing magic user and teaches at this magic school, and she has always felt like she missed out on having a similar opportunity because she didn't have that magical ability. But she is a private investigator, and when there is a murder at her sister's school, the principal calls her in to try and help, assuming that she will have more insight into the magical world because of her connection to her sister. But as it turns out, she has a terrible relationship with her sister, and so it kind of forces them to reconnect, sort of. So I really enjoyed Magic for Liars, which led me to read almost every other thing of Sarah Gailey's that I could get my hands on. Most recently, I read When We Were Magic, which follows a group of girls kind of developing their own magical abilities, and then unfortunately one of them kills this guy and they have to kind of deal with the ramifications of that. My biggest problem with that book is that they didn't really have any negative consequences, despite the fact that they killed someone. Like, it just didn't feel like that was taken seriously enough for me. But my favorite thing by Sarah Gailey is actually The Echo Wife. So this is a story about this woman who has invented cloning, and then her husband decides to have an affair with a clone of her, and as she kind of deals with that, her clone comes to her and they kind of decide together this scheme to kill their husband. The whole thing is very strange, but I really actually liked, like, both in Magic for Liars and The Echo Wife, I love her exploration of the dysfunctional relationships. So I really love The Echo Wife. So then we have Maggie Stiefvater, who again I've only read 6 things of, which feels wrong, but that's because I grouped both the Raven Cycle and the Dreamers trilogy together, which is 7 books, but I'm only counting it as one thing because you really can't read the Dreamers trilogy until after you've read the Raven Cycle, so it's kind of one thing. Anyway, the first thing I read by Maggie Stiefvater was The Raven Boys, the first book in the Raven Cycles. We follow this girl named Blue who lives in a family of psychics, although she doesn't have any psychic abilities herself. And she meets these private school boys, and she's always had every psychic she knows tell her that the first boy she kisses will die. So, you know, when things start happening with these private school boys, she's a bit worried about that. Also, one of the private school boys is looking for this dead Welsh king with the belief that if he's found, they'll be able to get a wish granted. I love this. It's a great introduction to Maggie Stiefvater's writing. I think a lot of people love this for the friend group, and I did like that. And I also kind of like the romance, but I actually just really love Maggie Stiefvater's writing style, and the way the magic in this is so abstract and magical and kind of goes in directions that you might not expect, especially in the Dreamers trilogy, which is based around one of the main characters from the Raven Cycle and his brothers, as well as some other new characters. So the Dreamers trilogy was the last thing that I read by Maggie Stiefvater, and it wasn't everything I hoped, but I did still really love it. And I'm tempted to say, because of certain elements in that series, that it was my favorite, but as I said, the ending kind of was a little bit disappointing. So actually, I think my favorite Maggie Stiefvater thing is All the Crooked Saints. This one I don't see talked about much, and I think it's because there was a little bit of talk about whether it's cultural appropriation, and I've seen mixed opinions on that from own voice reviewers, but we're kind of following this family of saints, the idea being that people come to them to get help and they perform 2 miracles. I don't really like to go too much into what this book is about, but I really loved it. And I think as well, for me, it had quite a big emotional impact. I know from talking to other people, it doesn't have that impact on everyone, but I really love this. That just the emotional journey that the different characters go through, but also I love Maggie Stiefvater's writing style, and this I think is some of her best. Just the way that she writes this very hyperbolic description that feels magical at the same time, and you're never really sure like what is true and what is just hyperbole. Like, I love it. So then I was surprised to find that I've actually read 7 things by Neil Gaiman. Some of those things I've really not liked, so I'm surprised that I have kept picking him up. However, the first thing that I read by him was American Gods, and I did really love that. We follow this man who is getting out of prison and discovering that his wife, has been killed in an accident, and he ends up kind of meeting up with this man called Mr. Wednesday and kind of going on a bit of a trip with him. There's a lot of characters that are kind of like Americanized versions of European mythology or mythology of different areas. And it's very dark and twisted in some bits, and it's also very slow in some bits, but I haven't reread it since I first read it, but I would like to, because let's jump ahead. This was my favorite thing that I've read by Neil Gaiman. The last thing I read by him I did also like though, and that is The Sleeper and the Spindle, which he wrote, and it was also illustrated by Chris Riddle. It's basically a Sleeping Beauty retelling with a little bit of Snow White mixed in there as well. It's a really nice twist on the original tale with a little bit more female empowerment, as well as having these additional illustrations, which I think really added to the story. It's maybe quite different from American Gods. And actually, I think almost everything I've read by Neil Gaiman has been very different from everything else I've read by him, which I think is why he's so hit and miss for me. Okay, then we're into the top 2. If you watch a lot of my book videos, try and guess who's at number 1. But number 2 is V.E. Schwab, or Victoria Schwab, she sometimes publishes as. So I have read 8 things by her. The first of those was Vicious. So this is a story about these young men in university who are investigating these people called extraordinaries who have extraordinary abilities. They're trying to discover how to get extraordinary abilities of their own. And it's written in 2 timelines. So in the later timeline, you know that they have these abilities and that one of them is now trying to kill the other. Actually, maybe they're trying to kill each other. And one thing I will say, so with Victoria Schwab, I love a lot of the concepts of her books, but I don't always like the execution. But this I really like the execution as well as the concept, like the way the extraordinaries get their abilities. I never want to say because it's spoilers, but it's really interesting in the way that it shapes what abilities they have. But also I think she in this did such a great job of having those 2 timelines really work together to reveal the story to you. Because more recently, I think the latest novel I read by her was The Fragile Threads of Power, which is kind of a spin-off from her Darker Shades of Magic trilogy, which I did really like, but The Fragile Threads of Power was just not for me. It focused too much on the characters from the first trilogy and was really dependent on you being very connected to those characters. And I think just because it had been too long for me, and I'm also not so much a character-based reader, so I was just really bored for most of the Fragile Threads of Power, unfortunately. But I think also after that I read one of the graphic novels that's also a spin-off of the Darker Shades of Magic trilogy, and I DNF'd that, so I think I'm just going to pretend that first Darker Shades of Magic trilogy is all that there is in that world. And I do think actually that Vicious is probably my favourite thing from Victoria Schwab. I almost want to say villains. There's some aspects of villains that I really liked, but there's also some parts that, again, it's that thing where she focused too much on the old characters instead of giving me the new characters' stories, and that's not what I wanted. So Vicious is also my favourite thing by Victoria. So then, the author that I have read the most things by is Brandon Sanderson. So apparently I've read 18 things by him. Maybe it's cheating that I have still considered a lot of different Cosmere series as separate things, because I think even though, like, I included The Realm of the Elderlings as one thing, even though it's 15 books, but I think there's a much more fixed order. Like, there's some flexibility, but mostly the separate series go in a particular order, whereas the Cosmere, you can mess around with it a bit. I did include like Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2 as one thing though, so I don't know. Anyway, I've got 18 things on my list, and it's possible I'm even missing some, to be honest. I was surprised that the first book, according to my Goodreads, that I've read by Brandon Sanderson was The Rhythmatist, and maybe that's why I'm so annoyed that he's never gotten back to continuing that series. It's kind of this world, like a post-apocalyptic America, where the states have split into islands, and there are these weird, like, chalk drawing monsters that are attacking people, and we're following this boy who goes to this school where they learn to draw these special magical chalk circles to protect people from these monsters. But unfortunately, he himself, even though he would love to have the ability to draw these circles with the magical ability, he doesn't have that ability. So it's a nice twist on the Chosen One trope. Unfortunately, though, after the first book, he's never gotten back to continuing the series. I think I saw him say that he's realized he would need to do a lot more research to do it justice, and he just doesn't have the time. But I'm still hopeful that one day he'll get back to it. Most recently, I am actually in the middle of Bands of Mourning, which is the third book in Mistborn Era 2. It's hard to talk about, but it's kind of a Western fantasy where we are continuing to learn about the magic of Mistborn and how it's been changed, I guess, in these more modern times compared to the original era. And we're following kind of this detective type guy as he investigates all these different murder mysteries. I haven't been loving this series, but I'm hoping that the second half of this book or the last book will change my mind. And there are a lot of things that I've loved by Brandon Sanderson. There are also a lot that I haven't loved, but there are a lot that I love. So I had to think hard about what my favorite was. But, you know, I think it's actually Elantris. And I see a lot of people say that because this was Brandon Sanderson's first published book, that you shouldn't start here because it isn't as good, so it isn't a good representation of what he can do. And I 100% disagree. I think this is a great representation of what Brandon Sanderson can do in terms of his world building and his magic systems and the way that he will have everything come together at the end in a surprising way, even though you can then see how all the clues were laid. And I really like some of the themes he's dealing with this, and I really love all the characters. I almost said Mistborn was my favorite, and I do really love that too. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm doubting myself, but like I really do think Elantris might be my favorite. And I think he might be writing like a sequel to this soon, so fingers crossed for that being the actual best. Maybe. Anyway, those were the first, last, and favorite books by some of my most read fantasy authors. Let me know if you've read those authors. Would you have picked different books as your favorites? Let's chat about it down in the comments. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.